International Soccer Preview. We are Soccerphiles Canada. Welcome to our continuation of Series 19. This one looking at the players of the 2023 Asian Cup, due to be played in January 2024. This episode is looking at the players of Qatar. Here we go. Hello and welcome to the International Soccer Preview by Soccerphiles Canada. I'm Kevin and this is Series 19 on the 2023 Asian Cup played in 2024. This is a players series and this episode covers Qatar's players. So we are doing this players media cast in two parts. So part one is a look at the candidates for the squad and their likelihood of making it. We think we went into too much detail in previous player media casts we've done. So we're aiming for a lighter, kind of more listener-friendly version this time. Part two will come out when the squad lists are released and the final squad is selected. We think that'll be in late December, and we'll go back over our list at that time and see who made it and who didn't. And we'll also cover a couple of other things like injuries and surprise selections. So more on that soon, what we cover in part two. As far as what we're doing now, we have made a separate video on what we'll be covering over the next 9 months. So YouTube watchers can see the link to that on the screen right here. And it can also be found in the show notes for both watchers and listeners. In short, we're focusing on the Asian and African Cups, both taking place in early 2024. And we have also started coverage of World Cup 2026 qualifying. So this part one of the players media cast has 3 parts. In section 1, we're going to give some general information on the team and discuss that. Section 2 is the main part where we look at the candidates for each position. And section 3, we will give some closing thoughts and preview part 2 in more detail. Okay, let's move on to part 1. So part 1 is some general information about the squad. And we'll begin with some comments on the squad. This is actually our 4th time doing Qatar. We've never done anything as much. We covered them for the 2021 Gold Cup. That is the tournament in North and Central America and the Caribbean, where they joined as guests, both in 2021 and in the recent 2023 edition, where we covered them again. And in between those two, we covered them, of course, for the 2022 World Cup. So we can be sure that they sent their best team to the 2022 World Cup. However, it is hard to know exactly what their first team is. After that, things become a bit more murky for 2 reasons, really. Firstly, manager Felix Sanchez was let go after the 2022 World Cup, and a far more defensive manager came in, Carlos Queiroz, who we'll talk a bit more about when we get to the players. After the World Cup, they had the Gulf Cup of Nations and then some friendlies and then the Gold Cup in 2023 in the summertime and then some friendlies after that. And basically for the Gulf Cup of Nations, we're not sure if they sent their best team. Some of the players from the World Cup were there, but some of them weren't. And the same is true of the Gold Cup in the summertime. And so we don't know, because it's a new manager, whether he's kind of changing the starting lineup, favoring some players over others and not inviting them to tournaments, or whether he's giving them a rest. Some of those who weren't invited to the 2023 Gold Cup came back and have played games since. So it's really kind of up in the air. And we're not very confident in our decisions as to who's definite, likely, and possible to play in this Asian Cup. But we can be sure that they will be sending their best team to this Cup. It's just that we're not really sure who it is. So they definitely did use those tournaments to try out some new players. And then it was kind of a mixed bag of the players from the 2022 World Cup that we used. So that makes it a bit difficult for us to make predictions for Qatar. The next thing we'll comment on, maybe we'll do these two things together, actually. The recent games, so I've already kind of alluded to those by mentioning the Gulf Cup, the Gold Cup, and the friendlies surrounding those. So maybe I'll kind of go through it again while talking about formations. So in the World Cup, they went with a 5-3-2 formation in all of those games against Ecuador, Senegal, and Netherlands. So those are pretty strong teams. So you can kind of see why they went with a very strong backline. That was under Felix Sanchez. So a very defensive formation for them. We know they weren't really happy with the result of that, but I guess they were protecting against being scored upon. Next, in the Gulf Cup, though, they were a bit more assertive, going with basically a 4-3-3 formation in there, or sometimes a 4-2-3-1 formation. So just 4 at the back, 2 central defenders, and a bit more attacking in their play. And then in the Gold Cup, it was kind of in between. They went with a 4-1-4-1 formation in 2 of the games, and a 4-2-3-1 formation in 2 of the games. So we kind of think the strength of the teams in the Gold Cup is similar to the strength of the teams in the Asian Cup. However, Carlos Queiroz is a more defensive manager, and so we might expect, I wouldn't say 5 at the back, but probably 4 at the back, unless they're playing kind of a weak team. The last thing we'll talk about here is their upcoming games. So we may get a hint of who the starters are in their November names, in their November games, because that is the start of the second round of qualifying for the World Cup in 2026. So in the first round, that was just a preliminary round. Those games played in October. We did a preview podcast for those small preliminary teams. But this is the start of the real round, where all the teams are involved, and they play they play Afghanistan, who beat Mongolia in that preliminary round on November 15th, and then they play India on November 20th. So fairly easy games, I must say. So probably won't be too defensive in those games, but hopefully they will give an indication of the players the first team players who we're not sure about. And I'm just going to backtrack a bit, because I realize I haven't been putting in the little graphic notes that I have. So we'll review a bit there. So comments on the squad. It's hard to know what the first team is, and that's partly because they have a new manager. And for recent games, to review that, we had the Gulf Cup of Nations and the CONCACAF Gold Cup, and also some friendlies in June, September, and October. October was actually a little tournament in Jordan that they took part in, a 14 tournament. The key points here was that in the Gold Cup and in the Gulf Cup in January and the Gold Cup in the summer, they brought some of their top players. So again, confusing the issue as to who their first team is. We talked about their formations, generally more defensive formations against tougher teams. And for the upcoming games, we saw World Cup qualifiers for 2026 will begin in November. And they play Afghanistan and India in their 2 games there. And we expect that they will be using their best players for that tournament, which may give us some insight into who their team will be at the Asian Cup. Okay, bit of review there. And let's move on now to part 2, Qatar's players, the candidates. So, generally we'll be rating how likely they are. So we're going to put Carlos Queiroz, the manager, as a definite candidate here. Maybe I'll put it there unless he gets fired in the next few months, which I gotta say I wouldn't mind, because I really preferred Felix Sanchez's philosophy, a bit more of an attacking philosophy, but more than that, a more positive philosophy. I've always found Carlos Queiroz a bit negative when he was manager of Iran, and especially against Egypt in the African Cup 2021. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Well, I won't give all the details, but he's a very experienced manager, having coached Portugal, United Arab Emirates, South Africa, Portugal a second time, actually, Iran, Colombia, and Egypt, and Iran again. So really experienced now, of course, manager of Qatar. And he's been involved in tournaments since the World Cup 2010, all sorts of tournaments with those teams. And I won't go into too much detail, except to say, you know, I found him to be a bit of a negative manager. First of all, very defensive, which can be okay, but more kind of negative. So, for example, in the 2023 Gold Cup, Qatar, over the course of, well, the first 3 games in the group stage, 13 yellow cards and a red. I think he got cards too. And just kind of a ill-tempered performance. And that really reflected what I saw in the African 2021 Cup for when he was manager of Egypt. They were kind of more ill-tempered than usual. So I think he kind of brings that to the team. Maybe I shouldn't be too critical. Obviously, he's well respected, but anyway, that is the manager of Qatar. Let's go on to the goalkeepers. We will start just by introducing the players and their likelihood. And then we'll build a bit of a narrative about what's been going on over the last little while. So we'll start with Michel Barsham, who we consider a definite candidate. And next we have Salah Zakaria, who we consider a likely candidate. Saad Al-Sheib is a possible candidate. And so is Yusuf Hassan, or Yusuf Hassan Ali. And just coming into the squad is Fahad Younes. We consider him pretty unlikely, actually, but because he just came in October of 2023, you know, when a player comes in kind of at the end like that, you never really know if they're being considered seriously. And then we have one possible but unlikely candidate in Shehab El-Athi. So let's go back to a bit of a narrative on these guys. And that starts with our possible candidate, Saad Al-Sheib, who was the starting keeper in the 2022 World Cup. So he's a veteran of the team. He's 33 years old and has 85 caps, and played first way back in 2011 in the Asian Cup there, where he was the backup keeper. And he was the starter in the 2019 Asian Cup, where they did so well, and also in the 2022 World Cup. However, after the first game of the World Cup, he was replaced by Michel Barsham. They only lost 2-0 to Ecuador there, but perhaps coach Felix Sanchez wasn't satisfied with the performance, so brought in Michel Barsham, who is 25 years old, and his first tournament was just the 2021 Gold Cup. So fairly new to the team, but seems to have taken over the starting position now, because he was also the starter in the 2023 Gold Cup, which Saad Al-Sheib was not even selected for. That's why we have him kind of moving down in terms of his likelihood. So Michel Barsham definitely seems to be the starter. He started most games there. So instead of Saad Al-Sheib, the backup keeper for the Gold Cup in 2023 was Salah Zakaria, and he seems to have moved into the second position for goalkeeper. That was actually his first tournament, Salah Zachariah. He is 24 years old, but he only has 4 caps, and he was only on the preliminary squad for the 2022 World Cup. Kind of running through all of this as the third string keeper is Yusuf Hassan. And he's not only been the third string keeper for the 2023 Gold Cup, but for all tournaments since the 2019 Asian Cup. So he's 27 years old, but he only has 9 caps. So we're talking really about the third string keeper for the Asian Cup here. And it seems to be between Yusuf Hassan and Saad Al-Shi. But as we saw, there are a couple of other candidates. Fahad Younes came in at the end of October. He was on the preliminary squad for the 2021 Gold Cup, but he was kind of off the team until he was called up recently, and he was on the bench in October 2023, so we have to consider him possible. And then possible but less likely is Shihab Elethi, who was the backup keeper in the Gulf Cup in January 2023. And I think he's been called up for a couple of friendlies on the bench since then, but doesn't seem a likely candidate here. All right, let's move on to central defense then. And again, we'll introduce the names and then build a bit of a narrative. So we have a definite candidate in Ahmed Suhai, and also in Tariq Salman. Both of those definite. Jason Gabber, we think of as a likely candidate. And Boulaim Kouki, a possible candidate. And also Yusuf Ayman, a possible candidate. So let's go back and talk about these players. So in the 2022 World Cup, we saw Qatar using a 3-man backline. And that backline was Boulaim Kouki, who is now just a possible candidate in the center of the defense. And actually it was left backs and right backs on the outside of the central defense there. So we'll get to them shortly. But basically what we see is when they're playing a tough team, they'll kind of draw back. So the left and right backs become central defenders, and left and right wingers often move back to the left and right back position, which we'll talk about those players a bit later. Okay, so Kouki in the Kouki in the World Cup, but he was not selected after the World Cup, not part of the Gold Cup squad there, but he has come back since. He started two of their 4 games since the Gold Cup, but he wasn't selected for the last 2 matches. So that's why we have Boulaim Kouki kind of as just a possible candidate here, although he's very experienced, 110 caps, and 33 years old, and he's been on the team for a long time as starter in the Asian Cup in 2019 to that great performance. So given his experience, I wouldn't be surprised to see him brought back in, but he hasn't played much since the World Cup. Rather, the new manager, Carlos Queiroz, has gone with Tariq Salman consistently. He was also a starter in the Asian Cup, but in the World Cup, he was just a substitute there, Tariq Salman. Now he seems to be a starter again. And Ahmed Suhai, he was a starter in the Gold Cup, also actually not selected for the World Cup, but now seems to be playing quite a bit. Started 3 of their 4 games since the 2023 Gold Cup. So coming kind of into a starting position is Ahmed Suhai. Jason Gabber was actually the central defender during the 2023 Gulf Cup. And in the 2023 Gold Cup, he was a starter, but lost his position after game 1. with Ahmed Suhai coming into the position. Okay, and finally we have Yousef Ayman as a possible candidate. He was a substitute in the 2023 Gold Cup. That was his first tournament, actually. And he has started none of their games since that Gold Cup, but he was subbed in for one and on the bench for three others. So Yousef Ayman, if selected, would probably be a bench player. So in summary, we are seeing Tariq Salman and Ahmed Suhai as the starters here. Jassim Gabber sometimes moves up into a defensive midfield position, but is a likely candidate. And given the lack of players, I wouldn't be surprised if Boulan Kuki was called back in, but maybe in a substitute role, and Yousef Ayman almost certainly, because they usually bring 5 or 6 central defenders to the Cup. So I wouldn't be surprised seeing all of these guys selected for the Asian Cup next January. Okay, we move on to left back. And again, the candidates are a definite candidate in Homam Ahmed and a possible candidate in Sultan Al Braqi, and I'm going to say possible but unlikely candidate in Abdel Karim Hassan. So going to the narrative on this, it was actually Abdel Karim Hassan, or sometimes called Fadlala, Abdel Karim Fadlala, was a veteran. Is a real veteran. He has 133 caps for the national team since 2010 and has been a starter in most of the tournaments since 2015, and was a starter in the World Cup too. But he hasn't shown up even on the bench for the team since the 2022 World Cup. So we're not sure what's happening with him. He's actually just 30 years old, so isn't kind of retired, really at retirement age. So it just seems like he's not being favored by the coach. The player who is being consistently selected is Homam Ahmed, and that's why we have him as a definite candidate. So he was a starter in the he was a starter in the 2022 World Cup, and it was Abdel Karim Hassan had actually moved back into the central defense, so he was on the outside in the 2022 World Cup and was a starter in the 2023 Gold Cup too. So he's been a consistent starter, Homam Ahmed, and we think he will be not only selected but the starter in the upcoming Asian Cup. Sultan Al Braqi is a kind of an interesting story. He's been around since the 2019 Asian Cup, in that he was selected for the preliminary squad, but hasn't been selected for any squad up until now. He's always been on the preliminary squads. No, wait, he wasn't on the preliminary squad for the 2022 World Cup. Anyway, he has been around, and last played actually for the national team in 2018. On the field, and last appeared in November 2021, but and now has returned after an almost 2-year absence in October to start. So there are our candidates, and again, they usually bring two to the tournament, and we have a lack of options here. So Homam Ahmed definitely. I'm going to say it's one of those two, Sultan Al Braqi and Abdel Karim Hassan, kind of coming back into the team for the Asian Cup in January. On the right side, the candidates are Bassam Al Rawi, sometimes plays as a central defender. We have him as a likely candidate. And we have Mosab Kadir also as a likely candidate. And Pedro Miguel, sometimes called Roro, as a possible candidate. And we also have Ismail Mohammed, who is actually more of a right winger, more of an offensive player, but has sometimes come back into that left-back role as a possible but unlikely candidate. So let's go through the narrative here. It was actually the possible candidate, Pedro Miguel Roro, who was a starter in the 2019 Asian Cup, where they did so well, all the way up until the 2022 World Cup. Was a real fixture there. However, kind of like we saw with Abdel Karim Hassan, he wasn't called up after the World Cup, so we're not really sure what his status is. He has actually been called up since, so in the September-October games he made an appearance, so he's not off the team, but he doesn't seem to be the starter anymore. So let's look at the ones who have been starting. Bassam Al-Rawi has often actually been a central defender, but recently has been playing more as the right back. And he was a starter in the 2022 World Cup, but lost his starting position. He actually wasn't on the bench, so not really sure what happened with him. He might have gotten injured. But anyway, he was called up for the 2023 Gold Cup and was a starter in that as a right back there. So he seems a likely candidate, and amongst all the candidates here seems the most likely starter. But we also have Mosab Kadir as a likely candidate, and he was basically a substitute in the 2022 World Cup and even before that. In the 2023 Gold Cup, he was subbed into Game 2 and then gained a starting position for Games 3 and 4. But in one case, he was a right back, and the other case, he was a right winger. So kind of does move up the field. And we would consider him more of a substitute because he hasn't started any of their games since the Gold Cup, but he was subbed in for one and on the bench for a couple of others. So I'm tempted now to move him down to a possible candidate, but we'll leave him where he is. And then again, Pedro Miguel, the starter in the 2022 World Cup, but kind of off the team since. The other candidate is Ismail Mohammed. And he, we saw in the World Cup, Pedro Miguel moved back into a central defensive position. So Ismail Mohammed was the right back in that five-man defense. He was also the right back in the 2023 Gulf Cup in January. However, that was the last time he appeared. So he seems to be off the team for the time being. So again, we think in terms of them bringing two right backs. For the moment, it seems like Al-Rawi is the starter, and Mosab Kadir is consistently called up. So I would put him a little bit above Pedro Miguel, who I like a lot. So I hope he comes back into the team. But given his appearances since the 2022 World Cup, we'd kind of put him third in line here. And Ismail Mohammed kind of an unlikely selection. Let's move on to the midfield. And for the midfield, it's a bit harder to build a narrative, or I really should say that the narrative just becomes very complex. So for this section, we're just kind of going to go through the candidates. Qatar doesn't often use two lines of midfield. So generally it's something like a 4-3-3 or a 5-3-2. When they do use two lines, it's usually something like a 4-1-4-1. So they'll have a stopper in the midfield, but usually it's just one line of midfield. So we're just going to go through the candidates, and I think there's not a lot of difference here between defensive midfielders and central midfielders, so we'll deal with them as one. For players who are coded as defensive midfielders, we have a possible candidate in Karim Boudayev, and also a possible candidate in Abdullah Marafi. And we have a possible but unlikely candidate in Salam Al-Hajri, or Al-Hajri. And finally, a player who seems to be off the team in Ahmed Fadel. And I'll just introduce the central midfielders too, because these are more likely candidates. So we have a definite candidate in Ahmed Fathi, and a definite candidate in Mustafa Tarek, a likely candidate in Mohammed Wad, and then a possible candidate in Ali Asad Ali, and finally a possible but unlikely candidate in Asim Madibo. But actually, I think he may be more possible than that, kind of a little less than possible, but a little higher than where we have him as possible, but unlikely. Let's go over some of these players. So Karim Boudaïef was actually the starting central midfielder in the 2022 World Cup, and he's a veteran of the team with 121 caps. His first cup being the 2015 Asian Cup, and basically being a starter in all the tournaments since then, including the 2022 World Cup. However, he wasn't called up for the 2023 Gold Cup, and so we're not sure really where he stands with the team. He was on the preliminary squad there, but surprisingly wasn't called up. However, he has returned since then, and in September 23, or September and October, started 2 of their games and subbed in for 1, and wasn't selected for the last match. So we're not really sure where he is. That's where we have him as a that's why we have him as a possible candidate there. Abdullah Marafi, also a possible candidate. He was not selected for the World Cup, and the Gold Cup in 2023 was his first tournament. He started game 3 there, so he was just a substitute, except for 1 game where he started. And he has appeared since October 2023, so kind of in the mix there. Abdullah Marafi. Possible but unlikely is Salam Al-Hajri. So he was on the roster for the 2022 Gold Cup, but just as a substitute. He didn't see any action there, and then he wasn't selected for the Gold Cup. So he was a part of the Gulf Cup, though, in 2023. So it's kind of still in and about, but really seems to be secondary to the manager's plans here. And finally, Ahmed Fadel was on the preliminary squad for the 2022 World Cup and the 2023 Gold Cup, and played in the 2023 Gulf Nations Cup. So is kind of in and about, but he hasn't been selected since the Gulf Cup last January. So we think he's kind of off the squad in terms of major tournaments. Okay, on to central midfielders, who the manager has been favouring, and we have Ahmed Fathi as a definite candidate, and he actually wasn't selected for the World Cup in 2022, but he had been part of the Asian Cup squad in 2019, just as a substitute there. But he was called up for the Gold Cup, and he was a starter in that tournament for the group stage. He was suspended for the game 4, as so many of them were, and since then he has started all 4 of their games after the Gold Cup. So he seems to be more he seems to be a more important player under the new manager here, and we have him as a definite candidate, Ahmed Fathi. And just as a note, when they do go with a 4-1-4-1, he has played in the stopper role, so a bit of a defensive-minded midfielder. Also as a definite candidate, Mustafa Tarek, and he was on the bench for the 2022 World Cup, but was a starter in the 2023 Gold Cup. Again, so we think the manager is favouring him. He started 3 of their 4 games since the 2023 Gold Cup, so seems to be firmly embedded, at least recently. That is Mustafa Tariq, sometimes called Mashal, Mustafa Tariq Mashal. And our likely candidate is Mohamed Wad. So Mohamed Wad has always been more of a substitute than a starter. But he was part of the Gold Cup in 2021. That was his first tournament, and was also a sub in the 2022 World Cup. He was a sub in the 2023 Gold Cup too, but he gained a starting position after game 1. And so now seems to be a consideration, a strong consideration. Since the Gold Cup, he started 1 of their 4 games and was subbed in for 2 and on the bench for the other. So he's being called up consistently. That's Mohamed Wad, who we would still consider more of a substitute than a starter, but seems a likely candidate for being on the squad. And then our possible candidate is Ali Asadallah, or also known as Ali Asadallah Kambar. And his first tournament actually was way back in the 2015 Asian Cup, but then he was kind of off the squad, not selected again until the 2022 World Cup, where he was a substitute. But he was also called up for the 2023 Gold Cup, where he was also a substitute, even though he did start 2 of the 4 games there. He started games 2 and 4. And since then, he has been called up for 3 of the 4 games, but only on the bench. So we consider him a possible candidate. That's Ali Asadallah. And finally, we have Asim Madibo. So he's been more consistently on the squad than some of these other players. It's just his recent appearances that have us putting him as a possible but unlikely candidate. So Asim Madibo was a starter in the 2019 Asian Cup, but since then has only been, at least at the beginning of the tournament, has only been a sub. In the 2022 World Cup, he was on the bench for game 1, but did gain a starting position. But then in the 2023 Gold Cup, he was back to being a substitute. However, the reason we have him as possible but unlikely is he hasn't been selected for any of the 4 games since the Gold Cup. So perhaps it's a bit harsh to consider him unlikely. That's why I say he's kind of between possible and unlikely. But perhaps the November games will shed some light on his current status with the squad. Being the veteran he is, with 54 caps, I wouldn't be surprised if he was called back in. Okay, moving over to the left midfield. It's a little hard to tell with Qatar whether the midfielders are kind of central, more defensive-minded, or more attacking-minded. That's partly because they use that 3-tier system or 3-line system. So the attacking and defensive midfielders are not kind of clearly separated. Also, players shift around their positions too. So we're going to go by just their designated positions here, which I sometimes change from the sources, from the websites I use, if I see that in the tournaments they're playing in positions other than what's being listed for them. Anyway, we'll begin with a likely candidate here in Abdulaziz Hatem. Abdulaziz Hatem is a veteran with 110 caps, and he's 33 years old. And he's been on the team since 2009, but his first tournament was the 2015 Asian Cup. And he's basically been a starter ever since then. In the World Cup, he started 2 of the 3 games and was a sub for the other one. And he wasn't called up for the 2023 Gold Cup. So one of those players who we weren't sure what their status with the team was. However, after the Gold Cup, he started 3 of the 4 remaining games and was on the bench for the other. So we think he's definitely in the manager's plans. That's all we have for players designated as left midfielders. And on the right midfield, we have the biggest veteran on the team, Hassan Al-Haidos, but just as a possible candidate. So he's the captain of the team. He has an incredible 172 caps and has been playing with the team ever since 2008, with the Asian Cup 2011 as his first tournament. So basically, he's been a captain and a starter, but he is kind of getting older. In the 2022 World Cup, he did start all 3 games, even though he subbed out of most of them at around 70 minutes. And then another player who wasn't called up for the 2023 Gold Cup, so we weren't sure what his status is with the team. Well, he did return after the Gold Cup and started 2 of their 4 games and was subbed in for 2 others. So he seems to be back in the team, but we have him as just possible here, really, because of his age. He's hang on, he's only 32 years old. So I'm kind of feeling like he's a bit old because he was looking a bit older on the field, which is why I thought they didn't call him up for the Gold Cup. But still has a few years left in him, and I'm still not ready to move him up to a likely candidate because he wasn't called up for the 2023 Gold Cup. But over the course of describing him to you here and being the captain and all, I probably should put him in the likely category, but we'll leave him where he is. Also on the left side, we look at the wingers. So these are probably more attacking midfielders, but they may play in the central midfield role too. So we have a likely candidate, Hazem Ahmed Shahata. Hazem Ahmed Shahata is quite new to the team since 2023, but he was selected for the Gold Cup and was a starter in that tournament. So more attacking there. He played as a left co-forward in 1 of the games and then as a left winger in 2 of the games. Since the Gold Cup, he started 1 of their 4 games and was subbed in for 2, but then wasn't selected for 1. But he does seem to be favoured by the manager, so we have him as a likely candidate. Kind of moving down in their likelihood is Khaled Munir, who we have as a possible but unlikely candidate. So he was with Qatar since 2021 and was selected for the World Cup, but didn't see any action, just on the roster there. In the Gold Cup 2023, he was also selected, but was just a substitute and only saw a few minutes in Game 4. But he hasn't been selected for any of the games since then. So we have him as a possible but unlikely candidate. But he's an example of many players that we maybe need the November games to really decide on what his status is with the team. Okay, and then players designated as right wingers, we have Al Abdullah Tamim as a possible candidate, and Naif Al Hadrami as a possible but unlikely candidate, and Amro Surak as a player who we don't consider a candidate. We say seems to be off the squad. So let's go back to Al Abdullah Tamim, and he is also new to the team. First selected for the Gold Cup in 2023, where he was a substitute, but he did gain a starting position in that tournament from Game 2 onwards. One of the many players suspended on yellow cards for the Game 4 against Panama. Since then, he hasn't started any of the games, but he has been with the under-23 team. So there are a couple of players like that whose status also is a bit up in the air. not really sure where we stand. Again, November may shed some light on this. Naif Al Hadrami was on the roster for the 2022 Gold Cup, just a substitute, and didn't see any action, but not selected for the Gold Cup in 2023. He was with the Gulf Cup of Nations in January of 2023. But we consider those players, if they've only played in the Gulf Cup of Nations, we consider them unlikely candidates for the Asian Cup. But again, that may change, and maybe November will give us some hint. And Amru Surag is just that case. He was selected for the preliminary squad for the 2023 Gold Cup and did play in the Gulf Cup of Nations in January 2023, but really hasn't been actually called up as a substitute or a player since that Gulf Cup. Okay, let's move on to attacking midfielders, and one of my favorites, Akram Afif. We consider him, though, just a likely candidate, and he was a real star in the 2019 Asian Cup, which was his first tournament, even though he first started in 2015 with the national team. A real star in 2019, a bit of a disappointment in the World Cup where he was fairly invisible, just a few good moments in there. But he was a starter in that tournament. However, he wasn't called up for the 2023 Gold Cup, surprisingly, and he's very young. He's only 27 years old, I think. Just let me check here. 28 years old, so not very young, but certainly young enough to not be off the team. And he did return, actually, after the Gold Cup in September and October 2023 to start all 4 of their remaining games. So seems to be back in the team now, and we have him as a likely candidate. We have 2 possible candidates in Abdullah Al Arak and in Mahdi Salem. And basically, Abdullah Al Arak is a substitute, but he wasn't called up for the World Cup in 2022 or the Gold Cup in 2023. But he did come back for the September games, and he was subbed in for 1 and on the bench for 2. So we consider Abdullah Al Arak a possible candidate. I got to admit there may be a bit of a lack of consistency in what we consider possible or likely or definite. I kind of designated at the time when I update their record. And sometimes when I'm actually doing the podcast, I kind of feel like we maybe got it wrong. But usually we're within 1. So let's talk about Mahdi Salem. And he's new to the team since 2023 and was selected for the Gold Cup, but was just a substitute, even a substitute in Game 4, where they only had a few players to choose from because there were so many suspensions. And since then, he hasn't started any of the games. In fact, he was with the under-23 team for 2 games and then not selected for the other 2 games. So definitely up in the air. And yeah, there's another player who, after describing him to you, I think is probably more possible but unlikely. Now, before I move on, I just want to go back and kind of review, because you may be noticing kind of a lack of candidates all the way from left midfielders up until the attacking midfielders that we're dealing with now. And part of the reason for that is that some of the players who started in the, and especially at the attacking end, some of the players who started in the World Cup but then were not selected for the Gold Cup in 2023. So we're not really sure which ones are going to be selected for the Asian Cup. Again, November may shed some light on that. So it might be that these players, going back to the left midfielders, and Abdulaziz Hatem, for example, we could move him up to definite because we only have 1 candidate over here. And we could kind of do that all the way down. I'm feeling that because there's just 1 right midfielder, for example, Hassan Al Haydos is makes him more of a likely candidate because of the lack of other candidates. And we could do that all the way. However, when we get to the forwards, or the players coded as forwards, we'll see that some of them have been playing more in an attacking midfield role. So part of the reason then is that the positions move around a bit. So even though they may be designated as a forward, they might play as a attacking midfielder, for example. Okay, and we don't have any players actually coded as secondary strikers. So we do move on to talk about forwards. And we have, again, a likely candidate, but we could really say that he's a definite candidate in Almoez Ali. Now, we're not sure if he'll actually be starting as he did in the 2019 Asian Cup and the 2022 World Cup, because he was just a bench player for the 2023 Gold Cup. But at least he was selected, and he has since started 2 of their games in September and November, and subbed in for 2 others. So I would say definite in terms of being selected for the squad, but only likely as a starter because he didn't start in the Gold Cup. Our next candidate at the likely level is Yusuf Abdurazak. And he was a starter in the 2023 Gold Cup. He actually wasn't selected for the World Cup in 2022, just on the preliminary squad there. And he has 25 caps, but just 2 goals. So obviously he's kind of not playing up front as a starter, maybe in a more supporting role. He's 24 years old, and as I said, 25 caps. So Yusuf Abdurazak, nevertheless, he is consistently called up, and he started all 4 of their games since the 2023 Gold Cup. So Yusuf Abdurazak, we think of as a likely candidate. And then we have 2 possible candidates, Ahmed Ala Eldin and Mohamed Muntari. So let's take a quick look at those 2 players. Ahmed Ala Eldin has been basically a sub from all tournaments since the 2019 Asian Cup, was a sub in the 2022 World Cup as well, but not selected for the 2023 Gold Cup. However, he came back after the Gold Cup and started 3 of their 4 remaining games. So we see actually that all 3 of these forwards so far have been used regularly since the Gold Cup. So obviously not all playing as forwards there. So Ahmed Ala Eldin, we have as a possible candidate. And finally, the ultimate substitute, who quite regularly comes in 70 minutes into a game, is Mohamed Muntari. So his first tournament was the 2021 Gold Cup, even though he had been, no, his first tournament was the 2015 Asian Cup, sorry. But then he wasn't selected for a few tournaments after that, until the 2021 Gold Cup. In the 2022 World Cup, he was a substitute. And then in the Gold Cup in 2023, he started game 1, finally getting a starting position. But then for game 2, he went back to being a substitute, and actually only appeared in game 2 there. Yes, and he has not been selected for any of their 4 games since the 2023 Gold Cup. So we have him as a possible candidate, but that doesn't look good for him. But he's been so consistently on the team since 2021 that we kept him as a possible candidate. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of part 1. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do in part 2 when the rosters come out. So we're going to wait until not only the preliminary rosters are published, but the final decisions made. And then we'll kind of go back over the list of candidates that we've built today, and we will look at any notable non-selections, any surprised inclusions, so that would be players who maybe are coming back from having not played for a long time, any new candidates. So both of those surprise inclusions and new candidates or new players would be players who are not on our list here. And then we'll also take a look at injuries and how that has been going. Right now is October when we're doing this, so it's a bit too far out to really look at the injuries. We'll do that in a podcast closer to the tournament. So we will see you again in part 2. We originally planned to tag on our past, present, and future plans for the mediacast, but we have instead decided to put a link to that 10-minute video in the show notes. It covers what we're working on and what we plan to do over the next 9 months. We'd like to thank Namur Abacham and Pixabay for the wonderful music you hear in this mediacast. The title is called Arabic Trap.